Try to keep it short and sweet as possible. Thanks, Ankit, for that introduction, I think. As Ankit said, I originally read hospitality management, hence the pubs, or perhaps because of the pubs, I read hospitality management at university. And I later became interested in sociological and anthropological work. It just seemed to add so much to what I was learning about in my hospitality studies. And like most academics, the presentation today has developed over quite a number of years in a string of research projects, and I'm just focusing on, as Ankit said, two of the more recent points today. I know we academics overuse jargon. I'm not going to apologise for it though. I will try to minimise this, but there's going to be a little bit, and we've got a little bit already in the title there. Piere Bourdieu, the French sociologist, some might say philosopher, developed this idea of habitus from his work in social class in particular. And it sounds a little bit like habit, and to a certain extent it is similar to the way that we use habit in the English language, but his concept goes beyond this. Educationalists, in particular, would probably see it as, second piece of jargon, tacit knowledge. The stuff that we do without really knowing what we're doing, perhaps, without explicitly understanding how we're doing something. We know how to do it, but describe it, a bit more difficult. Donald Rumsfeld, the past US Secretary of State, famously refers to this as things we don't know that we know. So you remember that speech. Tacit knowledge, not explicit. Tacit knowledge, the things we do without thinking. We learn to ride a bicycle. How do we learn? From a book? No, we learn by observing, trying, falling off, and suffering the bruises. Learning to eat with a knife and fork, or eat with chopsticks. Once you get past having to think about it, you do it much better. In fact, if you're riding a bike and you try to think about physics, you probably fall off. So it's a specific type of habit. It's based on how we learn to behave in our families, our class, our work organisations, and Bourdieu suggested, it determines our life role. Once we're thoroughly socialised into a way of doing things, into a group that we feel we belong to, it's quite difficult, not impossible, but difficult to change. You might think about the UK royal family. They still have a relevancy. I don't quite understand why, but they do. And they've changed. The royal family today cannot behave the way they did 1,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 50 years ago. But they're still there. They've reproduced themselves as an institution. And that's what Bourdieu is interested in, how we reproduce our institutions and how we belong to them. So the research settings, I call it 2.5. That's because one of the projects had 2 periods of field work. The first of these is set in my old hometown in the UK. I'm calling it Northam here, and it's a population of about 4,000 people. I was interested in the pubs. You can see some pubs in the village, some just around the village. And outback country settings of EPV. Again, it's not the real name, but we're supposed to nominise names. I spent several years doing both of these studies through an ethnography, literally, graphic, writing, ethno about people. So I'm interested in sort of culture. And maps. Where are we? What are we doing? The primary map is of the park, and I just thought it'd be interesting, fun to illustrate how big the park is. Small by Australian standards, but the village, the same scale, would fit into that several times. And I'm a bit obsessed with wombats. And wombats in the park, and most of the research is done around wombats. Not all of the research. So, what am I doing? I'm researching as an observer, observing what's going on, but also participating, sort of anthropological, sociological work. In the same way that we learn how to behave in our families, in our schools, by observing, by finding out what we can do, what we can't do, what we should do. And I'm taking this a stage further, perhaps, than most people do when they're introduced to and socialised in their organisations. I'm tacitly learning. I'm learning to do stuff, to do the volunteering, to do the beer drinking. I'm still not quite mastered that, so I need to practice a bit more. And analysing it. So I'm not just doing it, I'm not just learning how to do it, I'm trying to make sense of it. And that's where the ethnographer is really trying to research, understand explicitly that which we do tacitly. Enough about that. A bit more theory. Bourdieu, linked to this idea of habitus, is perhaps best known, and I'm sure we've all come across some of his ideas, as developing theories, sociological theories of capital. Social capital, cultural capital, the social capital, how we network, how we meet people, the people that we meet, the people that we know, the school we go to might be quite influential in that. It develops us as networkers, whereas cultural capital, how to exist within organisations, within families, within social classes. So the cultural knowledge. And he feeds this into the practice of doing things. So the habitus is a part of our practice. The capital is how we do it. And this also links to marketing theory, yes, a little bit of marketing, looking at partiality of roles. So, if we are customers, we're probably also partially employees of the organisation we're customers. We might, in our negotiations, be helping them to develop how they do things. We might, if we go to a fast food restaurant, clear our own table. We're looking at this more symbolically from Bourdieu's work. In the same way as employees are often a little bit like consumers. So you might socialise in the pub, you might engage with the volunteers if you're a volunteer team leader. So a little bit about the nature of these activities. I won't be able to give one a very brief taste here. But I'm seeing pubs and volunteering as based on tradition. Just before lunch, I was talking to one of your members about the way that volunteering changes. It's still volunteering, but it changes. Even within Rotary, you're constantly reinventing yourselves. So you're based on the traditions, you know the traditions, but you're prepared to develop those traditions on to suit the current day. And they're also socialising. So we join them and we learn how to behave within them, as suggested by Bourdieu. And this was identified as an issue by quite a few of the participants in both areas, both fields. Certainly the volunteers. They said, okay, we're being told stuff. We're being told how to be safe in the environment, how to deal with snakes. But we're also observing our volunteers and more experienced volunteers. So some might be coming back after working with the organisation for many years. But it's not like they're teaching us. We're learning through watching them, through observing them, through seeing how they behave, through seeing how they handle situations. And we don't even realise that we're learning until afterwards. This idea is tacit. I don't know really explicitly, but maybe later I've got the chance to think about it. As I was doing as an ethnographer, in the evenings we might sit and talk and discuss what we've done in the day. And they find that it becomes an important part of their life beyond the volunteering. They talk to their families about it. One person, whenever she walks the dog, she knows now which are weeds, which she can pull out. She's actually helping the environment even when she's walking the dog. Similarly in the pubs, we have People like this Smithy I'm mentioning, another pseudonym, who he came across, he's not from the same village as us, he's from outside, he's a bit of an outsider, but everyone likes him. One day coming home from work, he came across a pub, popped in, found it was a restaurant. Had a drink anyway. He came back the next night, and pretty much every night since. And he's actually not just engrossed himself in the tradition of being a pub user, but he's reintroduced it to the pub. He brings with him people. You can see a few in the bar here. They're actually coming to this place for the first time as a pub since it changed hands. The owners love it because it's a bit of local culture. It's reinvented the tradition of being a pub user. He's led the changes, but he's also socialising other people, and this is based on his own social experience. So this idea of partiality, I think, is really important. I think in any role that we see ourselves, what are we doing? The volunteers are volunteering. Yes, that's what they're called. Obvious. I don't need to tell you that, but I will anyway. They're also consuming the experience of the outback, the park, wildlife, learning. Learning is a consumption, isn't it? Or is it? Oh dear. They're acting as employees, not paid employees, but much more difficult employees to manage, volunteers. What a place to say something like that. They're also acting, in many cases, as citizen scientists. They are maintaining the park, but a lot of the work is about doing research into wombats, into flora, into birds, into goannas. They're learning science. They're learning to be citizens. Hang on a minute, they're also citizens. So I'm saying this is a really important citizenship behaviour, learning experience. They're becoming informed in research. They're comfortable with the idea when they ask, how many wombats are there in the park? I don't know. They're becoming comfortable with I don't know as a scientific answer. To my mind, that's the most important thing that anyone can learn about science. But then again, I'm biased. But we always have, yes, one of my favourite weekends in my entire life was working with the fairy rings, amazing creatures. But we're seeing citizenship, citizen science, as really feeding into citizenship education. The volunteering is citizenship practice. What about the local character? Reproducing, recreating habitus and cultural capital, sharing cultural capital, developing social capital. But also engaging in citizenship behaviour. The tradition in the UK of the first exposure you have to pubs is often as an underage drinker or as an employee. In both cases, you're being well looked after by paternalistic and maternalistic publicans and customers. They're making sure that even if you're breaking the rules, you're not breaking their rules. Yeah. So it's very much of its own institution. Less of that now, though. Traditions do change, obviously. So, also, and perhaps more important from a personal perspective, is both environments offer not just the chance to do this learning, to put it into practice, but also to think about it. Imagine being in a park like this with a group of like-minded people, but the opportunity to go off for a walk on your own when you're not working. Proper reflection and reflexive time. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? How am I doing it? In the pubs, it's more likely to be a social thing. What are you doing? And so on. But in the park, people were saying quite often that they were going home and they felt not just energized, not just satisfied in achieving something, but they felt a need to change something in their lives. So they are being explicit. The environment is encouraging it. An example, Bourdieu is often criticised by especially Anglo writers that don't really understand the French. I don't, but I try. What does he mean about reproduction? He's been criticised as it's deterministic. It's saying this will go on forever. We learn how to do things. We're told how to do things. We never change. Actually, no, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about change. And my own bias, this is an example of how that can happen in an institution. No one recognised this. This this is a few years ago now. This is probably one of the most famous football stadiums in the world. I don't know, I'm biased. Liverpool, Anfield, and the Albert. The Albert is a pub that started out as a local pub for the residents of Anfield, as the stadium did. It was a place where we went to join in with people on a Saturday night, the stadium and the pub every night. This changed just a little bit. Most of the buildings down in front and right are either pulled down or derelict. The stadium has grown. The pub is still there. There's nothing else around the pub. In fact, that strange structure wasn't there when I was last in Anfield. It was just an empty space. They say they're going to develop it, but they haven't yet. Will they? I don't know. It's protected by law. Some institutions, like some buildings, are protected for an interest, a special interest by law. But it's still there. It's still operating as a pub. It's not a pub for the locals. Very few locals go there. It's like a shrine to the club. So we've got people from all over the world. I used to sit at the back of the cop every week, every fortnight, and I'd be surrounded by people from Norway. That's where the Norwegians used to hang out. Other places where people from Surrey and London used to hang out. We didn't have much to do with that. But it's different. It's still there. It still exists. It's still successful in a different way. But the locals would go to another pub now, unless it's matched them. So it's a bit peculiar. It's a bit strange. It might seem like a loss. But if we see all our changes as losses, then we're probably going to be very disappointed as individuals. I'm going to leave you with a final thought. I'm not being using my time, probably over time, but I'll leave you with a final thought, which is one of my favourite sentences in the whole of scholarship. Partly because it's full of jargon, it's really long, it's really complicated. But one of my co-authors, who's now retired, we used to work in the pubs with him. He said, well, come on, Peter, they're educated people. Every now and again, perhaps we have to think for ourselves a little bit. We have to move beyond the simple textbook-like accounts. But if I have got time, I'll take you through my favourite. Am I going too quickly? See, here am I trying to rush because I thought I'd over-prepare. As I said, it's one of my favourite quotes. It summarises so many important ideas from his work. The idea that the structures that we live in, he's talking here about things like institutions, so not a physical pub building, but the idea of the pub, is the product of collective history. We share this, we all are aware of it. Perhaps we aren't all as aware as we could do. I'm amazed that none of my millennial students know what the 6 o'clock swill is. I mean, that's such an important, I just was shocked. I've mentioned this in so many classes. You've got this as an example. What are you talking about, Peter? Go away, you're English. Not that many by experience, I'm sure. But these are reproduced, these institutions. It's based on our tradition, but it's also based on our needs of today. We adjust our dispositions, our way of thinking, our habitus, our way of doing. And that comes from our history, our experiences at school and family, but also the ones that we are told about, the ones that we are introduced to later. So tradition is so important. Tell your kids and your grandkids about the 6 o'clock swill, please. I wish I could have experienced it at least once. Well, I have in England, but it's not called the same thing. But they're objectified in institutions, these ideas, and the institution, the pub, the monarchy, a university, your good selves. Yeah? And only by understanding this at a tacit level, understanding, knowing this at a tacit level, can we hope to inhabit, live within them. But only by trying to understand it at an explicit level can we hope to influence it in a constructive and perhaps a proactive way. We might by chance, but it's better to think about it and try and reason it. And we're keeping them in activity. The pub is still there. the voluntary organisation is still there, not working in the same part, but they're still there doing other things. We revive the sense of positivism, as did Smithy in the pub, but at the same time we're imposing the revisions and transformations that are necessary. So I think as a way of thinking about life, I don't know, perhaps I'm overdoing this, but as a sentence that could take any one of us forward in a constructive way, I'd say it's hard to be. That's it for now. Has anyone got any questions?
Focusing on the volunteering aspects of it, the sociological dialogue that you've presented us with, where do values sit in this? Where do values?
Yes.
The values we all grew up with, from whatever generation we were in, and how have they influenced our need to actually volunteer?
And if we were to look at this, what I would suggest is that if you're talking about values, and values, as we all know, I'm sure, one of the more complex human ideas, because how far are they individual, how far are they shared? Can we share a value? Well, what we're suggesting here is that the things like the durable adjusted dispositions, not quite the same as a value, but a similar sort of idea. Disposition, a way that we identify ourselves within a particular institution, a particular situation, a particular circumstance, a particular group of people. So we can identify at an explicit level what we mean by those dispositions. I think it's very close to values. I mean, how do we communicate values with ourselves and with each other? Probably the best way is by how we behave, like the team leader, not preaching, but by behaving, by showing. As soon as we start to tell people what their values should be, we're going down a very slippery path. So that's sort of probably how I would see it fitting in. Think about values. I was just talking about this with my students yesterday, and what are our values? I'm pretty sure I could come up with value statements that everyone in this room would agree with. Justice. Yeah? What does that mean? What does justice mean to you? Does justice mean fair go? Does justice mean equality of opportunity? Does it mean equality of result? Equality of reward? Does it mean an eye for an eye? So, sorry, I didn't catch that. But it can mean so many different things. So I think the only way we can start to really engage with our values is by talking about them. And so observation, seeing people behave in a respectful way towards other people, towards animals, towards the environment, towards beer, and you have to respect beer because it's really very, very dangerous. Almost as dangerous as whiskey. But that's only part of it. You can't tell them what they are, but in those reflective periods, either by yourself in the park or with your fellow volunteers or with people in the club, even if you're drunk, you can still make sense sometimes. But you actually start to discuss it. Well, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to you what we're doing today? What we saw on television yesterday? What the way that wombats are treated by farmers who get a bit annoyed with the holes and bury them alive. You know, you can actually start engaging with it explicitly as well. I think volunteering is such a natural way, an avenue of doing that, because people are mostly there because they want to. Mostly.
Thank you. You brought out my Republican background. I'm not sure whether that is on your screen.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm biased, but I don't mind people knowing it.
Most people don't know, it's a lie there. The question I guess I'm wanting to ask is, from a societal, from your studies, how do you explain that from a world point of view, there are large numbers of people who've never been to Anfield, who, it's just been recent that Liverpool's been in America with huge crowds going. They've never been to Anfield at all. Doesn't matter anywhere in the world where you go. Liverpool came to Australia and they played at the Adelaide Oval and also at Melbourne Cricket Ground, where You'll Never Walk Alone, and the song was belted out by many, many people. But what I'd like to ask is, what brings, from an international point of view in society, or even at a local point of view, because you come to this city, you're either a Port person or a Crows person. What causes that to happen?
That's easy. Do you drink Chardonnay?
As a pretend Scouser, my mother was Scout, my father was Manchester, so he was the evil one in the family.
So was my father.
I think it's a difficult thing to answer, but one of the most interesting books on football with the Randall that I read was called The Football Tribe. You might be familiar with Desmond Morris's work. He actually did some ethnographic work working in football clubs in the UK. And he likened it to his other book on tribes. He saw so many tribal factors in how people behaved. And of course, I think this was written around the time when football violence was a little bit more prevalent in the UK. Now it's more likely to be found in sort of South and East Europe and in South America. But it's this idea of a tribe is, I don't like to use the word primitive, but it's a feeling of belonging that is almost visceral. It's really identifying with an idea. And some clubs, sports clubs and others, do somehow catch an appeal. And I think that it can be around things like a disaster. One of the things I find really important whenever I go to Anfield is to go to the shrine, where you might come across Hillsborough, and there's other places, like I used to go to Bradford, and in Bradford they had a fire there, which was another great loss of life. That's part of the story. Perhaps the legend or the myth is also related to stories that get passed around. Perhaps a song. Most sports clubs have some sort of musical accompaniment. I couldn't say what it is here in the AFL clubs, but I know that some sort of music goes on. Yeah, am I right? And yeah, so tribalism and needing a sense of belonging. I think that the social media today make it a lot easier to identify with places that we've never been before. People see places like Anfield as a place to visit. I mean, I see it on social media a lot. I mean, members of the clubs, people. I'm coming to Anfield for the first time. I'm sort of 60 years old and I'm really looking forward to it. How do I do it? Where do I go? And people really see it as a major thing. I recently reviewed the paper looking at cafes as places of pilgrimage, which I thought was a little bit pushing it, but I think club stadium may be sort of similar to some places of pilgrimage. Perhaps it indicates a lack of belonging in other parts of our life. Perhaps it just represents an alternative. I cannot really answer the question fully, but I don't think anyone could. But tribalism, we want to belong.
Thank you for those entertaining questions.